So here's the video lecture for the beginning of part 5, which is the Romantic period. You see by the dates here, the Romantic period is generally accepted to have lasted from 1820, the end of the Classical period, until 1900, which is, of course, the beginning of the 20th century. As always, with all of these periods, things are blending in and out. You know, everyone did not stop writing classical style music in 1820, and everyone did not drop the Romantic period in 1900. It's just kind of a gradual transition from period to period. But within this 80-year period, there are certain hallmarks across music, literature, and everything. Romanticism was a complete cultural movement involving, well, it started like most of these movements start, many of these movements start with literature. It stressed emotion. It stressed individuality. If you think about kind of the hallmarks of classical music, classical period music and art, it's very logical. It's very balanced. If you've got a 4-bar phrase, it's answered by a 4-bar phrase. Cadence points are very clear. Harmonic progressions are very clear. Everything about classical music, it just screams balance, structure, and logic. The Romantic period, the artists wanted to go much further afield. So the opposite of acting logically is acting emotionally. You could say it's acting illogically, of course, but acting emotionally causes one to act illogically. So emotion, individuality, and imagination. If we think of the 1700s as being the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, the Romantic period is kind of the age of self-expression, going against all of that logic, as I said. The whole idea was to take the mind further afield than it had been before through the use of your imagination and through the use of many different influences. Painters went away from that very balanced, clear, clean, logical structure and started using much brighter colors and much more outgoing subjects. A lot of action, a lot of energy in Romantic painting. If you think about it, when we talked about the Baroque period 2 periods ago, the art was full of motion and full of action. The Romantic period kind of went back in that direction. Pretty much every artistic style comes about as a reaction against the previous period, which is why if you wait around long enough, something's eventually going to come back again in all things, you know, fashion for that matter. Emotional subjectivity. What is subjectivity? Well, if you are being objective, that means that you're looking at something and just weighing the facts and not letting your emotions get in the way. It's a real goal of people to look at things objectively, certain things. Well, looking at something subjectively means you're looking at it filtered entirely through your emotional state, through your feelings. So the whole point in all of the arts was this emotional subjectivity, to emotionally affect the viewer, the reader, or the listener. Some of the major influences: nature was a huge influence on the Romantic artist. Fantasy. Fantasy actually has a double meaning, in meaning the supernatural. That, of course, is something else that people were fascinated with during this time, and I'll kind of get to that as I kind of hit high points and all these. Irrationality, we've already talked about that. Dreams, which eventually led to the work of Sigmund Freud at the end of the 1800s and his work in psychoanalysis. People began to look at poor people, people of different social classes, in a more romanticized, there's that word, way, trying to depict their true feelings and their true suffering. Violence, all of these things that maybe didn't have a place in art of the classical period were strong influences on art of the Romantic period. Remind me, I'll show these pictures again in class, because I'm sure you can't see them too well. But one example of the influence of nature on the arts is the American painter Winslow Homer, who painted many seascapes. This is one of my personal favorite paintings. It's called The Herring Net. It hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago. Fantasy and the supernatural. Well, the beginning of the Romantic era, just 11 years in, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which is a parable about many people think about the Industrial Revolution and the dangers of mechanization and industry. Well, that was written, Frankenstein, one of the two most famous horror stories ever written, was written at the beginning of the Romantic era. And at the end of the Romantic era, we get Dracula, this other of the two most famous horror stories ever written. The fascination with the poor, this is a painting titled The Gleaners, about people who are picking grain from a field. The fascination with dreams and the unknown. Goya's painting, The Sleep of Reason Breeds Monsters. Nature, a hugely favorite subject. This is John Constable, The White Horse. Chivalry and romance. There was this fascination during the 1800s with the Middle Ages, but it was a very sanitized view of the Middle Ages. This is where the King Arthur legends really became a huge part of literature with the book Le Morte d'Arthur by Mallory. And of course, Ivanhoe was an incredibly popular book written during the Romantic period, and here is a painting of a scene from Ivanhoe in this romanticized, there's that word again, view of the Middle Ages. It seems like everybody was a knight or lady in waiting, and the poor don't really get mentioned that frequently. Architecture revived Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages. The Cathedral of St. John's the Divine in New York City, which is, I believe, on 112th and Amsterdam, if I remember correctly. I've actually played a couple concerts in there. It is the largest Gothic-style cathedral in the world, and they started building it in the late 1800s. It took them over 100 years to finish it. There's a timeline. I'll touch on this timeline in class. So, how did these artistic movements make their way into music? Well, first of all, the Romantic period has a huge number of significant artists, writers, painters, artists I said already, and musicians. And I think a lot of that is because of the individuality that each artist attempted to create, so that there are so many different musicians who had something very personal and interesting to say, that there are more musicians out of this period than any other period that we're going to talk about. We're only going to be able to talk about a few of the literally hundreds of musicians whose music has remained active and performed today. Now, that's not to say that they threw everything in the classical period away, because in the Romantic period, what they did is they took a lot of the forms and genres that existed in the classical period. For example, the symphony and the string quartet and opera. These things all continue, and the concerto, these all continued to exist, but they really stamped the Romantic artistic ethos on them. Beethoven was the largest influence on all of these Romantic composers. The intensity, the passion and emotion that he put into his music is something that musicians of the Romantic era really wanted to imitate. Also, the fact that he was an independent musician who wrote what he wanted to write and was not under obligation to fulfill the duties of the job of a court composer. That was also very inspirational to the Romantic artist. However, there are significant differences between the classical period and the Romantic period. Number one, greater range of tone, color, dynamics, and pitch. The composers were looking for a much larger amount of sounds that they could get from the ensembles. They wanted also these groups to be able to get louder and also softer, and they wanted them to be able to play higher and lower. This resulted in the expansion of the orchestra from the fairly small orchestra of maybe say 40 musicians that we see in the classical period. It got bigger and bigger. The harmonies, and I'll play some examples of this for you in class, are very simple, stable, tonal chord progressions in the classical period. In the Romantic, they start adding notes to these chords to make them more dissonant, to make them more agitated sounding, to give you more momentum to move along. There's more dissonance, which creates more conflict in the music, eventually leading to more satisfactory resolutions, you could say. All of the music was not all the music, but music was very closely linked to literature. Everything from songs, where the composers would set poems, all the way up through massive operas and large symphonies that are based in literary works and various novels. They developed some new forms, both small forms and larger forms, and we'll talk about those in class. And then greater tension, less balance and resolution. Whereas in the classical period, as I said, all of the music is very balanced. 4 measures balanced by 4 measures, clear cadence points, clear resolutions. In the Romantic period, they did away with a lot of that because they wanted the music to be more unstable. They wanted the music to be more emotional. And one way that they could affect your emotions was to be less predictable. Other characteristics. Individuality of style. This is one reason why, I mean, in the classical period, the 3 major composers were Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, especially early Beethoven. And while they all have their own specific characteristics, overall, all of the music sounds very similar. In the Romantic period, the composer's music can sound radically different from each other. The goal of the composer was to express themselves and also to be identifiable. Certainly, a composer would want to write music and have people recognize it as being their music. All of these things that we talked about and that I mentioned in art go in music also. The exploration of feelings, the exploration of, some composers explored supernatural and diabolical. There's that word. That's all linked to a specific book by Johann Goethe titled Faust, about a man who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for wealth. That became an incredibly influential telling of that story. And through the Romantic period, we will see many, many composers set Faust or aspects of Faust to music. Nature, incredibly influential. And then subjects from the Middle Ages, including Shakespearean plays, very popular subjects, especially for opera composers. Some new movements that we see invented in the Romantic. Nationalism, which was a political movement of self-identification with your country and your culture. That is reflected in music, and we'll get into that in detail. Exoticism. Well, exoticism is the opposite of nationalism. If nationalism is a person attempting to reflect their own personal culture through their music, exoticism is attempting to sound like music from a foreign land, maybe someplace that no one in your audience has ever visited, and you're trying to evoke it for them. And then these are both linked with the idea of program music. Program music is music that is specifically associated with a story or an idea or maybe even an object or a place. It's music that, without any words at all, it's instrumental music only, attempts to sound like something specific, something physical, or maybe even something conceptual. And program music was the first program music that I'm familiar with was written, 100 years before the Baroque period, in Vivaldi's Concerti, The Four Seasons, where he wrote music that attempts to sound like spring and summer and winter, etc. But in the Romantic period, program music really becomes a dominant force in instrumental music. It's really fascinating, and we will listen to multiple examples of this in class, about how the music can try and make the listener think of certain things, running water, or a peasant celebration in a village, or a castle where the nobility lived, just evoking this through certain musical gestures. Very influenced by literature. Much program music is a direct telling of a story that someone else wrote. Other program music, as I said, can represent specific objects. How did they get as I mentioned before, this expanded tone color? Well, they expanded the orchestra. I mentioned that. They added some new instruments to the orchestra. The tuba to play low notes, the piccolo flute to play very high notes. They added trombones came into the orchestra. The percussion section was much larger. We don't just have clarinets. Now some composers add a bass clarinet to get a lower sound out of that area. And to balance all of these new woodwind and brass instruments and percussion instruments, the string section had to get larger as well, so that the strings would not be overwhelmed by the sounds of the woodwind and the brass. This gave them an increased range of tones, of timbres that they could use. Also, the piano. The piano had some improvements. They replaced the old wooden frame on the inside of a piano with a cast iron frame. If you were to open the piano over here in the classroom, you'd see that the frame on the inside is made out of cast iron, which gave it an expanded range of volume, different tone colors, and also the piano itself. The keyboard grew up to, I think everyone probably knows that a piano has 88 keys. Well, that became the standard during this period. Colorful harmony. Composers take the standard chords and they start adding notes to create more and more tension, and they start delaying the resolution of these chords. Instead of a little bit of tension and then resolution, a little bit of tension, more tension, then eventually resolution. By the end of the period, there were composers who were stringing dissonances together with no resolution in sight, just to keep the audience on the edge of their seats. Expanded range of dynamics. Well, this much larger orchestra also meant that you could play much louder, and composers asked for that. Instead of just writing one F, which means loud, or even two Fs, which means very loud, composers might write 4 or even 5 Fs. But they didn't just expand it in the range of very loud, they also asked musicians to play even softer. So instead of 1 P, which means soft, you might have 3, 4, or even 5 Ps. In the works of Tchaikovsky, for example, there are specific instances where the orchestra is asked to play 5 Fs, very, 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 very loud, and 5 Ps, very, 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 very soft. Expanded pitch. Well, we've added the tuba, we've added the contrabassoon, which are the lowest instruments in the woodwind and brass section. We've also added the piccolo, the highest instrument in the woodwind and brass section, actually in the entire orchestra. And composers are now asking all of the instruments to play at wider extremes of range. Of tempo. Faster music, getting even faster. Slower music, getting even slower. More abrupt changes. All of this, all in the idea of serving emotion, of making the music affect the listener more emotionally. Expanded range of form. Some of the new forms that they develop are very short. Songs that last 2 minutes long. Piano pieces that last 45 seconds. Miniaturization of these forms. And expansion of forms, where an opera written during the classical era might last 2 hours, 2.5 at the outside. By the end of the Romantic period, we're seeing operas written that last 5 hours. That is a long opera. Whereas a symphony written by Mozart might last 20, 25 minutes. A symphony written at the end of the Romantic period by a composer like Mahler might last well over an hour. So they're taking these forms that already existed and they are expanding them in the number of performers, in the length of the performances. Music becomes huge. Now, one of the things that changed all of this was a real change in society. Due to various things like the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon took over France and then he invaded and conquered much of Europe before he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, the number of aristocrats in Europe dwindled. Germany and the Congress of Vienna actually, instead of having 300 different little self-governing cities or states, went to a more unified government. So there were, due to all of these factors, both violent and peaceful, there were a lot fewer courts of the nobility to hire composers, and many of the courts couldn't afford to hire professional musicians anyway. So musicians were forced to make their own way by working as teachers, by working as music critics, by working as professional conductors, by writing more music that they could sell to the middle class. That expansion that we talked about in the classical era of the middle class really has its fruition here in the Romantic era. And this is all led by Beethoven. Beethoven, who not only with the emotion of his music, but the fact that he never worked for the nobility, and he wrote what he wanted to write, the music that he heard in his head, instead of writing to fulfill the orders of some member of the wealthy that he worked for. He was the true inspiration for all of these Romantic composers. They all wanted to be like Beethoven, and society had changed so that many times they didn't have a choice. They had to try and make it as an independent musician. So these composers are writing for this expanded middle class that I started to talk about in the classical period. They would have public concerts with regular subscriptions, so members of the middle class could come to multiple concerts. Musicians would try and make money that way. Another thing in this changing of society was the establishment of music conservatories. The first one was established in Paris in the late 1700s, and these were places where anybody who had the talent and the ambition could go to study music to become professional musicians. Whereas before, you studied music primarily, it was a family business, or you learned through the apprentice system. In the Romantic era, it became much more possible for anybody to become a musician. And many of the most famous musicians of the Romantic era actually started out as the children of middle class or poor parents who showed the talent and the ambition, and they could go study music. This expansion of the middle class meant that everybody was making music at home. The piano, one effect of the Industrial Revolution was that manufacturing processes got streamlined and made more efficient, which made it possible to build more pianos faster, which brought the cost of them down, which meant even more people could own a piano at home. So many of these composers were writing music to sell to this middle class public. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave this portion of the lecture off. Some of these points that I've addressed, like nationalism, exoticism, I will get into as we go further through this. But in class, we're going to pick up with chapter 3, which is the art song, one of the original developments in the Romantic period.